Okay, so I'll switch into English now. Liz, thanks very much for being with us. I was explaining this is our first sort of scientific event in the context of what in Spain is called a cátedra, which is like a privately funded initiative. And we're very happy to get this going. I'm very happy that you're the first speaker we've actually got on this series. We will hope to continue throughout next year if all goes well. We're also delighted to have you back. A lot of people have already, I was saying before, they've heard you before, because we've had you in Seville, I think, once, or perhaps even once in Seville, and the other was Leon, wasn't it? I believe. Yeah. But anyway, the Spanish community of autism practitioners and researchers know you very well, and you're very much appreciated here. So thanks very much. And it's all yours.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this, series. And I'm absolutely delighted to be the first session. I'm going to apologise in advance if there's a bit of I'm using notes, so if there's some rustling of papers, please excuse that. I hope it's not too distracting. But it's wonderful to be able to give this talk and to have the opportunity to talk through some ideas about autistic flourishing and well-being to the Spanish autism research community, and to be able to think about how our broader research community can make a real difference to autistic people's lives. And it reminds me of, talking in this way reminds me of scenes like the one in the photograph that you can see, which is of my great friend and autistic colleague, Wen Lawson, talking ideas in my dining room along with a host of other researchers and my daughter, plotting a better way forward for autistic people all across the world. And it is that hope for a better way forward that I want to talk about today. So my ambition in this talk is to initiate a broader discussion about what the foundations for a good life for autistic people might be, and how autism research can help and currently sometimes hinder us all to secure those foundations. So I'm going to try and do all of that in 3 relatively straightforward sections. So first, I'm going to ask us to take stock of the extremely difficult 2 years or so that we've just lived through. And as with all crises of all this sort, I think it's revealed both resilience and vulnerabilities. And as such, I think it's, it can prompt reflection. Then second, I'm going to move from the current moment and its lessons to the longer term goal. So once we know where we're starting, that is, we can begin to think about what is possible on the road ahead. Working to identify, the fundamental aspects of a theory of a good autistic life, or what I'm calling a theory of autistic flourishing, following a series of eminent predecessors whom I'll also talk about a little. Then third, and finally, I will set out what that theory of flourishing might mean for us in our practice as researchers. So there you can see there are 3 straightforward parts. Even if it's not exactly a small amount, I'm trying to bite off in one talk. So let me start with the extraordinarily difficult years we've just lived through. So COVID-19 has taken a horrific toll on the lives, health and well-being of millions of people all across the world, and it still is. And the measures needed to constrain it and to mitigate its worst effects have had their huge price too. So in many places all over the world, people were required to stay at home unless engaging in essential activities. So schools or stopped altogether. Restaurants, bars, theatres, museums closed. People were told to work from home. Socialising with family and friends was halted. And as so is often the case, autistic people have so often been on the front line, carrying the heaviest burden, while not getting the attention they deserve from public policy makers and public health officials the world over. The differential impact of the pandemic autistic people was identified by both researchers and campaigners almost as soon as the pandemic hit. So in this slide, you can see Tom Shakespeare and colleagues' vital effort to describe the differential impact of the pandemic, not just on autistic people, but on all those with disabilities, in their path-breaking Lancet paper in 2020. So they say, people with disabilities have been differentially affected by COVID-19 because of three factors. One, the increased risk of poor outcomes from the disease itself. Two, reduced access to routine healthcare. And three, the adverse social impacts of efforts to mitigate the pandemic. They go on to say, risk of death from COVID-19 between January 24th and November 20th, 2020 in England was 3.1 times greater for men with disabilities and 3.5 times greater for women with disabilities than for men and women without disabilities. So Shakespeare and colleagues called this triple jeopardy, the triple jeopardy facing people with disabilities. Those who were living in institutional residential settings, for example, witnessed levels of infection far in excess of those living in more conventional households. Those who were dependent on key healthcare or other support services were also particularly at risk, as those services either shut down or became far more difficult to access. And those who were living with mental health challenges like depression and anxiety were prone to respond far worse than others to government-mandated restrictions like the stay-at-home orders which followed in most countries as the virus ripped through communities. Since Shakespeare's paper, a host of other large-scale studies have confirmed his central hypothesis. Those who were more vulnerable prior to the pandemic have tended to fare far worse than the overall population during it. And sadly, we know in the vast majority of countries across the world, if not all, that would have included a significant number of autistic people facing challenges to their health, their social services, and their economic well-being far in excess of many others. Many of the studies that have demonstrated this harsh reality have worked at an aggregate or a quantitative level. And crucial as this overall picture of the pandemic's impact has been, we also need a more fine-grained understanding of what has happened for autistic people during COVID. And that was the ambition that led me, together with 7 autistic and non-autistic collaborators from the UK and Australia, to organise an in-depth qualitative study on autistic people's experiences of the initial phase of the pandemic. And the autistic community's desire to participate in this work was huge. So I've never received such a response to an invitation to share views and perspectives. Within weeks of setting up our study, we'd spoken in depth to 144 people, often talking for more than an hour each. So that's more than 7,000 minutes of recordings, which we then had to analyse. And they were sharing stories of a level of intensity and honesty that I haven't come across before. And what we discovered was extremely compelling. So contrary to some of our, most pessimistic expectations, a number of the autistic people reported some positive experiences during the earliest months of the pandemic. So in particular, they felt that the stay-at-home orders, which is what we called lockdown in Australia, freed them from some of the overwhelming demands and expectations of living in a neurotypical world, a world that is not typically set up for them. Suddenly, some of the most pressing requirements usually placed on them, such as the need to fill in endless paperwork to secure their insurance and welfare benefits, were lifted, as was the need to negotiate physically getting kids to school, heading off to work, doing the shopping, keeping the household running while, juggling many competing commitments. So there were some positive experiences. Nonetheless, the overwhelming message was that this momentary sense of relief did not last. So in fact, within weeks, it was crowded out by a sense of often severe difficulty. And this difficulty, though, did not emanate from the first two of Shakespeare's, most anxieties about the virus itself and about access to services and healthcare. Instead, it predominantly came from the third, the social implications of the pandemic experience. So far from welcoming, the isolation that came from the lockdown, as many commentators had suggested that autistic people would, the vast majority of autistic people that we spoke to reported deeply missing the social contact that used to be a key aspect of their world. Our autistic participants, including young people, adolescents, and adults, intensely missed seeing their friends. So Zoom, FaceTime, they were insufficient substitutes for the physical, embodied interactions with other people that make up, most of day-to-day life. And they also said, often to their own surprise, that they missed the more incidental social contact in neighbourhoods or workplaces or community settings that they had once taken for granted or had even noticed, and that was now taken away. So not having much, or in some cases any, social contact during the COVID-19 lockdown period made them long for it. As one autistic adult described to me in this quote, she said, I didn't realise how important that incidental human contact was to me. It was so incidental that it never really registered on my radar until it was gone. The paying for the petrol at the service station, as much as it shits me, because I work with an assistance dog, right? So everywhere I go, I've got this giant, white, majestic beast next to me. And so the soundtrack of my life is like, oh my God, it's a dog. It's a beautiful dog. What kind is he? How old is he? What does he do? And that drives me bananas most of the time. And I've actually found myself even missing that. Not being able to have those physical connections with others, even incidental connections, seem to have a huge impact on people's mental health. So one autistic adult that I spoke to said, as she was crying, I can't deal with being isolated like this. I just want to hug someone. Other people appreciated how much they needed connections with others, as this autistic parent describes. She said, I've always looked at those sort of islands you see for sale, going, I could totally be a hermit and just live somewhere in the middle of nowhere and never see another person. Happy days. Because people are really exhausting. But this has taught me that actually I do need people. I think the first probably 6 weeks, I didn't have enough contact with people, and that made my mental health worse. So the missing of deep social connection, and particularly incidental social contact, flies in the face of so many common stereotypes about what autistic people want and what they don't want. How many times have we heard it said that, autistic people don't want friends, or they prefer a life of social isolation? We even have prominent theoretical accounts of autism that contend, that autistic people have diminished social motivation. And our study showed how clearly that was not the case. The imposed isolation and the resulting reduced pressure on having to interact with others revealed just how important social connection is. Now that in itself, I believe, tells us something extremely important, and something which has implications far beyond the specifics of the case. So the experience of the pandemic, and most importantly, the experience of what we felt we lost during the pandemic, has helped all of us see what really matters in life. So one scholar that has made that clearer than almost any other is the Harvard political science professor Danielle Allen. From the very earliest moments of the pandemic, Professor Allen brought together a broad multidisciplinary team to identify the best public policy responses to the pandemic, and that has informed practice right across the world. But as you can see here, she contends, most importantly, that it has also told us something even more profound. The pandemic reminded us that human flourishing should be our fundamental goal as a society, and that such flourishing extends beyond basic material and physical security. As she puts it, the impact of the pandemic is a reminder that life requires us to do more than just survive and get by. It absolutely needs those things, of course. I'm not saying it doesn't. But they are not by themselves enough. And they should not be the sole subject of our efforts. Instead, as Professor Allen says, the fundamental goal we now need to commit ourselves to is enabling people to thrive or to flourish. What we want is for people not just to get on, that is, but to have identifiably good lives. To be able to, to do the things that they want to be able to do, especially those that help them do everything else. So we should take this, pandemic moment to spur us to think again about the foundations of human flourishing, and in our case, autistic people's flourishing. So all of that takes me to my next set of questions. If the pandemic provides a moment to kind of step back and reflect on what we all really want and need from life, well, then what are the key dimensions of autistic flourishing, and how can we hope to identify them? So there's been a debate about the key elements of human flourishing since the very beginnings. Most accounts start with Aristotle, and it remains a crucial element of modern day philosophy too. So Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach draws heavily on the idea, and the political philosopher Diva Woodley has also made a major contribution. This idea has also, animated the more specifically autism literature for many years now. So Jim Sinclair's work, which celebrated autism both as a way of being and as a disability to accept and support, has enabled many of us to appreciate elements of a good autistic life that many have previously overlooked. And the advocates of neurodiversity have helped us to look at these questions anew too. Personally, I owe just as much to the in-depth conversations that I've had with all of these wonderful autistic collaborators, colleagues and friends over the years, even before the pandemic, on precisely this question. 12 years ago, I organised one of the first conferences on the ethical foundations of autism research at University College London. And in that conference, we brought together so scientists of all kinds, with autistic activists, philosophers, clinicians, family members, and the broader public. And the talks there were hugely thought-provoking, honest, and engaging. And the discussions were very lively and sometimes quite raw. I don't think I've ever been in an academic space with so much energy as that day. And one of the most powerful talks was by Wen Lawson, who you saw on my first slide. And he talked about the notion of interdependence. Wen said that day, throughout the generations, society has consisted of people needing one another. It's not shameful to need others or depend upon others in one's life. Some support and assistance more than others. Supporting autistic people and their families is just as needed as support for neurotypical people and their families. It might just be different in its extent and in its delivery. So the notion that we're all dependent on each other, that is, we are interdependent, should not have been a revelation to me 12 years ago, but it most certainly was. Especially because it contrasted so sharply with the negativity that came from those who say that autistic people can't achieve the independence for which others aspire. If we acknowledge that we all depend on each other at different times in our lives, and that can, in fact, be a good and vital part of life, then everything begins to look different. just as it does when we recognise that autistic people live through the pandemic restrictions longing for greater social connections, not celebrating their isolation. It reminds us that the version of autistic flourishing that we often find in the autism research literature, whether implicit or explicit, just leaves a great deal to be desired. So drawing on all these wonderful conversations and more formal philosophical assumptions together, I want to suggest today that there are at least 5 ways in which we, as an autism research community, need to reconsider autistic flourishing. So 5 elements or building blocks of autistic flourishing that have not had the attention they deserve. So the first among these is a need to move from a perspective that says that the core to autistic flourishing is simply health, to one that says it is the far broader notion of well-being. As autism researchers, many of us have inherited a medical model that says health is what matters. As such, our research remains, firmly embedded within the conventional medical paradigm, prioritising a putatively objective standard of bodily and mental health over an apparently worrying subjective understanding of well-being. Our research also continues to draw extensively from the developmental psychopathology literature, which stresses the importance of patterns of maladaptation in shaping the life course of autistic people. As a result, individual autistic people, so children and adults, behavioural, cognitive, neural functioning are frequently compared to some typical or normal level of ability that is held as the ideal state of health. And following from this, interventions and treatments still typically aim to remediate these apparent shortcomings, bringing them into line with the accepted norm. Now, this narrow focus on health results in a radically constrained understanding of the experiences that can shape autistic lives or enable those lives to go well. It has the tendency to see elements of the autistic experience that stand outside the norm as deficits or deviations. Indeed, so much so that even when autistic people outperform non-autistic people in scientific experiments, our tendency as researchers is to interpret those achievements as somehow revealing a problem. That is, data that in fact reveals strengths in autistic people are paradoxically and bizarrely interpreted in a negative way, as a consequence of a deficit or an impairment. As the autistic scientist Michelle Toulson and her colleague Laurent Matron so clearly describe, they say autistics, like non-autistics, have genuine difficulties in many areas, and like non-autistics, require assistance in areas where their performance is weak. But autistics uniquely are seen as pathological when displaying significant or dramatic strengths, creating for autistics a nearly insurmountable disadvantage or disability not faced by non-autistics. In this way, the medical paradigm colours our own perceptions of autistic people's capacities in various areas. It also limits the range of supports and services that can be actively considered, focusing predominantly on efforts to enable autistic people to conform to non-autistic people's expectations. So if we want to work toward a theory of autistic flourishing, my contention here is we need to shift from a medical paradigm that prioritises health to a paradigm that prioritises a much broader sense of well-being. But just focusing on well-being isn't by itself enough. It has to be well-being that is primarily determined and defined by autistic people themselves. So the second essential move is from an other-defined framework to a self-defined one. At the moment, even when researchers and policymakers use the language of well-being and quality of life, These are often derived from a set of standard life achievements on which autistic people typically fare badly. As Gary Lamb and colleagues very aptly put it, just as the medical model limits critical understandings of autism in the academic literature, so too may psychological accounts of well-being limit rather than expand possibilities of living a good life for autistic people. For example, autistic people are shown to be far less likely than non-autistic people to go on to post-secondary education, to hold down a job, to live independently, or to have friends and intimate relationships. And it's concluded, as such, that autistic people have a poor quality of life. I'm not suggesting that these normative life achievements are not important, but they do not by themselves provide an account of autistic well-being. And that's because we've far too rarely examined whether these life achievements are considered meaningful from the perspective of autistic people themselves. And when that does happen, the outlook often changes. So in the last decade, there's been a series of studies that began to compare standard researcher-defined measures with more subjective autistic person-led measures. And what these studies have demonstrated is that outcomes on these measures do not always match up. For an example, an autistic person who might be highly dependent on others for their care, a so-called poor outcome according to standard frameworks, might nevertheless be really happy and see themselves as enjoying a very good quality of life. Or another autistic person who may no longer meet diagnostic criteria for autism, a so-called good or optimal outcome, might in fact struggle to find their way in the world, always feeling different and distant from others. And it's not just that we get misleading results if we don't attend to subjective experiences. We fail also to grant autistic people the dignity, the agency, and the respect that they deserve. No one has high quality of life if their life goals are primarily set or evaluated by others. One other way of putting this is that if we want to take well-being seriously, we need to take autistic autonomy seriously too. And here again, I refer to Danielle Allen, who says in her latest book, human beings are creatures that need to chart their own courses in life. They thrive on autonomy, the opportunity for self-creation and self-governance. And that is true even of people who are largely dependent on others, to help to meet their needs. So if we really want to come to a theory of autistic flourishing, we need to understand what a good life means to autistic people themselves. So this focus on autistic autonomy and self-evaluation then takes me to our third element, or building block, of a theory of autistic flourishing, which I've called from the move from the big to the small. So once we ask autistic people what actually matters to them when they consider their good life, they very quickly tell us that it's not generally the grand kind of moonshots of academic research or public policy making, but a range of far more everyday concerns that build up to the weft of ordinary life. And this all became very apparent to me more than 10 years ago when the brilliant Tony Charman and I decided to examine the state of autism research in the UK. So in that research, we looked at how much had been spent on autism research and what it had been spent on. And then we asked more than almost 2,000 autistic people, their family members, practitioners and researchers to understand what they thought of it and where they thought the funds towards autism research should be prioritised in the future. While autistic people and their family members were impressed by the quality of British autism research, they were not at all convinced it had anything to do with autistic flourishing. As one parent said to me, she said, I fill in all these questionnaires and do everything I can to help, but when it comes down to it, it's not real life. Too many people feel that there's a huge gap between the more grand, abstract knowledge that's often produced by research and their real life, everyday experiences. The vast majority of British autism research at that point simply wasn't taking enough, wasn't asking how can an autistic person learn to catch the bus by themselves and to keep themselves safe. And it wasn't helping them get the shopping done or how to make friends and maintain, relationships. Our participants wanted to see real changes for themselves, their child, or for the person, with whom they support. Autistic people thought British academics were not taking enough notice of real life, everyday issues. And they were right. This was also driven home by the participants in our COVID-19 study. They also, they deeply felt the loss of their everyday routines and expected experiences. And they also felt that no one had noticed how important they were. Because of the lockdown, participants were unable to engage in the kinds of everyday activities that many had strived hard to access in the past and which were essential for their well-being, like going to the library, the local swimming pool, the cinema, the mall, weekly sports training or dance class, the playground with the kids. One adult said, pretty much everything in my life that I loved doing was taken and was just gone. And another adult, this time an autistic parent, put it, even the meaningless stuff had become meaningful and needed. As a research community, we've been too neglectful of the mundane aspects of life that matter to people. So if we want to work towards an account of autistic flourishing, then we need to move from the big to the small. And in part, this is because we've neglected the broader context which creates the range of real opportunities for autistic people, including the policy context. And that takes me to the fourth element, the need to move from an individual understanding of flourishing to a contextual one. So pervasive adoption of the medical model in conventional autism research has also meant that there's an overemphasis on specific attributes of individuals as opposed to the broader context in which people find themselves. In the conventional medical model, autism and its associated disabilities are seen as something inherent to the individual. Biomedical research tends not to explain an autistic person's difficulties with reference to the context in which the difficulty occurs, so home, school, work, in the community, but rather as a characteristic of the individual themselves. Taking this individualistic starting point suggests that the fault for difficulties in life resides with the individual themselves, and thus the burden of correcting perceived difficulties lies there too. Treatments and interventions situated within a medical model of disability have thus been designed to modify, diminish, or enhance autistic children and adults' behaviours to address these goals. Let me just illustrate this phenomenon with an example on the treatment of stimming behaviour, so rhythmic, repetitive behaviours. Seen through the lens of the conventional medical model, there's been a tendency to perceive so-called repetitive motor stereotypies, such as hand flapping, as an individual problem with no clear purpose or function, and which prevent the child, or indeed adult, from learning adaptive or other skills. In fact, it now seems likely that they often serve a regulatory, soothing function for autistic people. A study inspired by the work of Robin Stewart and led by autistic researcher Stephen Kapp that I was involved in showed that many autistic participants reported their stims to be calming and helped to soothe what could be sometimes, really intense feelings, helping them to regain a sense of control. As one participant described, he said, it sort of metronomes everything in your body to sort of go at that speed. So it just sort of helps quell everything. In designating these stimming behaviours as some sort of deficit needing to be fixed, we've neglected something important. It's the broader context which creates the problematic response, not the behaviour itself. Non-autistic people's reactions to stimming is the issue, not the stimming per se. Attention will be better directed towards social interventions that aim to shift the negative perceptions of stimming. So it's the contextual response to the individual here that we need to address rather than the individual themselves. And all of this has powerful lessons for what we need to think about. For if the possibilities of flourishing depend not just upon the individual, but instead what the political philosopher Diva Woodley calls the individual in context, then we need to move our attention away from its sole focus on the individual and their strengths and weaknesses, and appreciate instead what it is that makes anything possible or impossible for them. That means accepting that the world needs to change as well as the individual. As Woodley says, taking into account the reality of context necessitates that we wrestle with the systematic power asymmetries that structure the world we share, which then requires us to account and seek to mitigate the effects of oppression and domination. So 4 elements of a theory of autistic flourishing so far. Moving from health to well-being, from other-defined to self-defined, from the big to the small, and from the individual to the contextual. Some of you will be thinking that much of this should seem, self-evident. So my 5th element of a theory of autistic flourishing asks why so many of us in the autism research community miss these first 4 for so long. In part, I believe it's because of a long history of theory of mind research, which suggested that autistic people have an impaired ability to reflect on their own mental states, of which I contributed to. This has led, I think, to the questioning of the veracity of autistic people's accounts of their own experiences. They're often seen as unreliable, and as a result, researchers have often avoided attending to first-person testimony, preferring to privilege reports from parents or teachers or other informants, or lab-based observations, over considering the perspectives of people themselves. Indeed, as Donna Williams, an autistic advocate, described, right from the start, from the time someone came up with the word autism, the condition has been judged from the outside by its appearances and not from the inside, according to how it is experienced. As well as shaping research findings, this lack of attention to autistic people's perspectives has the consequence of ensuring that autistic people themselves have almost no say as to what gets researched in autism science, why, or how. Ever since the idea of autism was first developed in the 1940s, autism science has typically been designed and conducted without any significant input from autistic people. And I think that has contributed towards research agendas and research methods that rarely relate to the challenges that autistic people face. And when I say input, I mean beyond input as passive participants or subjects in research, because they most certainly do that, but input in the decision-making processes around research, in the design and implementation of the research, and in the analysis and in the interpretation of the findings. That is, being partners or collaborators in the research. And as we know from my own work, that lack of involvement results in real feelings of frustration. Indeed, in a focus group that I ran for one study, one autistic adult, looked at me and rather skeptically said, whatever we say, is it really going to influence anyone? Encouragingly, in the last decade, this has begun to change. There is a slow but growing movement towards collaborating with autistic people and their allies as part of the research process, where autistic researchers and community members are actively involved in making decisions about research. These decisions can include what kind of research is done, how it is done, how the research results are interpreted, and how the findings are used. These so-called participatory processes draw on the practical wisdom of non-scientists and have been shown outside the field of autism to have a dramatic effect on both the researcher and on the effectiveness of the research. So the fundamental idea here is that we will learn more, we'll understand more, we'll know more once we've put lived experience and research experience together. So putting all of this into one, a theory of autistic flourishing, recognises that subjective well-being matters as well as bodily and mental health, stresses that autistic people should have the same interest in choosing their own lives as anybody else, accepts that the everyday aspects of life matter to people, not just those that seem big from the outside. Understanding that the context in which people live always shapes opportunities and is therefore an appropriate subject for research. And contends that we will only notice any of this if we work side by side with autistic people and allies when designing and conducting the research. So I want now, in the final section of the talk today, to say a little bit more concretely about how I think our research might change if we accept this approach. In other words, what would our research look like, what would our practice look like, if we give well-being prominence, if we amplify autistic autonomy, if we attend to the everyday, if we acknowledge context, and if we co-design and co-produce. So for my third and final section, as I move towards the conclusion, I want just to highlight two studies that might start to give us an answer. And the first of these comes from the field of executive functioning. I'm pretty positive I don't need to define executive function for you, but for those of you who don't know, executive functioning is an umbrella term that includes those skills, largely mediated by the prefrontal cortex, which are necessary for goal-directed behaviours. So they're critical for doing everyday things, like trying not to eat the big bar of chocolate that's currently in the cupboard, or switching between tasks while trying to meet a deadline. Researchers have long held that autistic people have executive problems, but and this, at least superficially, kind of seems to map on to reported problems in everyday life. Yet, despite decades of research on executive function in autism and hundreds of published papers, the existing scientific literature has almost nothing conclusive to say. Instead, it remains contradictory and confusing, with, according to a recent meta-analysis, group differences of only moderate effect. And such effects are a far cry from the large effect sizes reported on questionnaire measures, either self or parent report, of real-world executive function, and also the everyday planning and flexibility difficulties that are reported by autistic parents, people and their parents in our own work. So why is there such a disparity between how autistic people and their families report their lives and the views of the established science? And it goes back to many of the themes that I've raised so far. For example, a tendency to look for the grand, abstract explanations than to look at the everyday detail, and a tendency to think of it as an individual failing rather than a contextual response, all underpinned by an unwillingness to take seriously the perspectives of autistic people themselves. So experimental investigations of executive function in autism have heavily relied on structured behavioural paradigms designed for the computer or tabletop to try and target, specific components of executive function, just like the one that you can see on your screen, the so-called Tower of London task. So people here are given a pegboard, or they see a pegboard on their computer screen with red, black and white beads all set out in a particular configuration, the start state, and they're asked to move the beads from the start state to this new configuration, the end state, in the minimum number of moves. And better performance on this task reflects better planning ability. Such tasks, however, lack representativeness. That is the correspondence between the task and real life settings. And they also lack generalizability, so the degree to which performance actually predicts problems in real life settings. In my own work, we've consistently shown that a significant portion of autistic children and young people can pass these tasks with ease. Yet they and their parents often report really struggling with many apparently related tasks in everyday life, like shopping in the grocery store or finding one's way around a new town. The conventional way of measuring executive functioning in the lab simply isn't measuring what autistic people want it to measure in real life. So what are the real life phenomenological experiences of autistic people's executive control? And how are they limiting their ability to thrive? What should we be doing if we wanted to help autistic people flourish? We don't know much about any of this, in part because we've so rarely bothered to ask. In a qualitative study that Lorcan Kenny, Anna Remington and I did with autistic young people and their parents, we found that the real life executive issues they reported were highly variable and depended, crucially, on the context in which they were doing the task. For example, like cooking at home versus cooking at school. They depended on their mental state, so their level of anxiety, depended on their clarity of the task instructions, and just as this quote describes, their motivation or their interest in doing the task. As this young autistic person put it, as he was telling us about his ability to plan and kind of change tack, he said, so if it's something which I really don't like, I find that I'm often a lot slower than if it's something which I really do like. And yeah, sometimes my mum has said stuff like, once you've finished your college assignment, you can play your clarinet. And I'm just like, well, seeing as I don't really enjoy clarinet playing, I don't think I'll ever get this assignment done. Our current laboratory-based, researcher-designed measures of executive functioning do not allow us to capture the context-dependent nature of everyday executive function or the important role of non-executive factors that might actually influence the deployment of executive control. And it doesn't need to be like this. Attending to autistic people's own perspectives provides one very straightforward way of changing our focus. For example, one autistic young person described how he has a one-track mind. He went on to say, that's nothing to be particularly ashamed about. It's just the way I work. I just think it's because my mind, like subconsciously or consciously, just prioritizes one piece of information over the other. And for that reason, I'm not able to remember everything. His insights align with an autistic-driven concept known as monotropism, a tendency to focus attention on one thing at a time, which attracts most or all of one's processing resources. Remarkably, this concept of monotropism was put forth back in 2005 by Dinah Murray and Wen Lawson and Mike Lesser, but it has thus far received scant empirical attention in the literature. Our participants also talked about difficulties starting, stopping, or changing direction. And these reports map onto the notion of autistic inertia, a concept that comes up repeatedly in early and current autistic writings and blog posts, and even in a recent paper by an autistic researcher, Lene Buckle. And on the face of it, autistic inertia seems to be driven by executive-related difficulties like cognitive shifting or motor planning, that ability to shift, stop and start and change tack. But the precise, so the componential nature of such real-life difficulties have not been examined by researchers. There is barely any mention of autistic inertia in the research literature. So what should we do instead? take autistic flourishing seriously. Sorry, I think I'm missing a slide here. So one of our studies that we're currently doing at the moment, which is co-produced with autistic and non-autistic researchers, is looking into the nature of autistic inertia, or what people have called flow. And people talk about it as it's the single most disabling part of being autistic for me. It's a daily struggle. But it's also revealed, the potential plus sides of that inertia. So what some people call flow, a concept that's actually derived from the broader psychological literature, which refers to being immersed in a particular thing, which, depending on what that thing is, can bring real joy to autistic people's lives. As this young person says, the flow feels really good while I'm in it. It's fantastic. I'm actually doing something. I'm actually making progress, or I'm actually making a difference. I'm doing something that I like to do for once. Now, these early findings for this study of what we're doing on autistic inertia illustrate the importance of developing a new approach that bridges that gap between lab and life through attending to the everyday, through acknowledging context, and through taking seriously autistic-derived concepts like autistic inertia or like monotropism, as well as their ideas and experiences. So that was my first example. My second and final example of research, which takes the 5 elements of autistic flourishing seriously, comes from a wonderful project in which I worked with a team of autistic and non-autistic researchers to gather the untold histories of late diagnosed autistic people in mid to late adulthood. And in this study, we adopted a participatory approach. So it was a collaboration between non-autistic academic partners, autistic co-researchers, and autistic community members, an autistic advisory group, who all actively participated in making decisions about the research, including from getting the funding right to analysing the data and disseminating the findings. It was, in other words, a deep and sustained effort at genuine co-production in autism research. Co-production which includes involvement by autistic researchers in the design, conduct, and analysis of the research. We also adopted an oral history approach, which records recollections of people and groups to preserve their voices and their stories, and situates them within a particular time and place in history. It's attendant to those realities of oppression and domination of which we just saw Diva Woodley speak. So in this study, we invited late diagnosed autistic adults to share their life histories, to understand better the consequences of living without a diagnosis, to elucidate what precipitates an autism diagnosis in mid to late adulthood, and also to identify the perceived impact of receiving that diagnosis. So what did we find out? So these adults spoke about their sense of self and how that had changed over time. They told us about many negative experiences, including trauma, which had shaped how they think about themselves now. For most, though not all, autism diagnosis had a very positive impact on their sense of self, allowing them to understand more about their own past and to feel good about their autistic identity, reinforcing their well-being, contributing to autistic flourishing. Tanya, one of our participants, described recognizing herself as autistic as a light bulb moment. And for Malcolm too, the light came on with diagnosis, allowing him to reconstruct my perspective of who I am and who I want to be. Veronica described how her transformation in sense of self was linked to her diagnosis. She says, as you can see in the slide, and what was my life before diagnosis? It was bits and pieces of disconnected things. I was a failure, right? And there was no centre. But there was a centre. Me. The centre is I'm autistic. And that explained all of that. Previously, some researchers have said that autistic people have a limited or impaired sense of self. Instead, our research shows that some autistic people reflect deeply on their lives and their changing sense of self-identity over time. There were so many lessons that we could derive from this Hidden Histories project, mapping onto each of the proposed elements of autistic flourishing. The crucial role of attending to subjective well-being, the vital place of a sense of identity and autonomy in giving meaning to people's lives, the realization that the crucial moments of life aren't defined in advance, but emerge often in the most mundane and apparently everyday of settings. The need to attend to the public policy choices that make diagnosis possible and support people going through that process, particularly late in life. And perhaps most of all, it revealed the importance for autistic people of working with autistic researchers in genuine co-production. Our participatory efforts in this study ensured that the research processes were thorough, respectful, and supportive of our participants, who often describe, really harrowing lives. And being able to talk to an autistic interviewer brought extraordinary rewards. So our participants told us that their open and authentic interactions with our autistic researchers meant that they were more forthcoming than they might have been with a non-autistic researcher, or at least, a researcher who was not on their wavelength. That is to say that the sense of empowerment shared by those autistic people who were given the opportunity to reflect on their lives directly with an autistic researcher provided access to insights that they might not have shared otherwise. Focusing on flourishing gave us better research. So I wish I could talk about that in way more detail, but that's not kind of my purpose today, and my time I think is almost up. But what I do want to do just before I close is tie what I've said together today. So as I said right at the start of my talk, it's a huge honour to spend my working life as an autism researcher. I have wonderful colleagues and collaborators with whom it's an absolute joy to work. And I get to meet the most fantastic people, as you can see in my closing slide here, whose lives can be full of the most immense challenges, but who inspire us every day in their creativity and their kindness and their commitment, and who deserve to be able to live their very best lives. What I've aimed to show today is how that realization, obvious though it is on the surface, can also encourage us to think again about the priorities that we set ourselves, changing the focus of our work and the way in which we've done it. So my personal commitment coming out of the pandemic and all that has gone before it is to make the possibilities of autistic flourishing more explicitly the centerpiece of my work. I've said today just a little bit about how I intend to go about it, by giving well-being prominence, by amplifying autistic autonomy, by attending to the everyday, by acknowledging context, and by co-designing and co-producing with autistic people and their allies. And I look forward very much to hearing about how you all do it too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a great talk. Thanks. Let's get a bit organized here. You can't see us or anything at all at the moment, can you?
No. Do you want me to
if you stop sharing, then you'll be able to see the chat, and you'll be able to see a few people clapping, the ones that know how. And
okay. Yeah, is that
great,
right?
yeah. Yes, good. A great talk. Thanks very much. So I think we got a bit of time for questions. There are a couple of hands already raised, I think, or maybe not. So you can see, you're seeing the chat, right?
Yeah. Yes. Kind of.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
good. We're getting
Yes.
some thanks and some congratulations there. So if there is anyone who would like to ask a question, now you've got where there's a little arrow in the middle next to your mics, you can, sorry, on the right there, you've got a little thing which says raise your hand, a little person with their hand raised. So if anybody has a question. Yes, Marta.
Hi, it's not really a question. I just wanted to say, Professor Pellicano, that it's such an honor. I am a PhD student, so I'm just starting my trip to research, and it's so inspiring to see that we are changing and shifting from this medical model perspective to more participatory research, which is indeed important. So thank you very much. It was super great to hear you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, and best of luck with your journey.
Thanks.
I've got a couple of questions. I got since we got the opportunity.
Yeah.
So I like the way you bring together. I mean, as I say, people have used the word inspiring. I think that's greatly defines what you presented to us today and brought together a whole bunch of stuff. And actually, a lot of things which I think come from different places, because some of the stuff you're mentioning, even outside autism research, like the concern about how close is what we see in the lab to what happens to people really, not much because it meets or not their needs. So how well does what happens in the lab actually reflect cognition in action, in context, in a way? So I guess that is kind of a question you put there, which is sort of general to cognitive science or psychological science for that purpose.
Yeah.
So let me push this a bit further, right? So somebody could say, what role is left for science? I mean, I understand you've obviously you're stressing what we don't do, and that you give it a great weight, and obviously that's where we should go. But there's kind of a strong emphasis on phenomenology in a way, on self-description as a way of accessing the reality of things. Where does that leave the other tools we have in research and psychological research, saying other ways of looking at things? Because in a way, I mean, you make a strong point, and I totally agree. The point of view of, in this case, autistic people, but it would the point of view of your participants, really, in a way, is essential to understand whatever is. What about other points of view, or what about so-called, traditionally called objective view of the science, or with its other kind of tools? Does it have a role? Does it not have a role? How does it, you've got a handshake there, and where you sort of say one was research led, and the other one, I think was the thing was life led, or what it would be left. What would it look like on the science side, or how does the science side change apart from actually embracing and involving people? Is there room for some of our more traditional tools at all? What does it bring, or values, or methods?
So my short answer, David, is absolutely. So I'm not eschewing science in the slightest. I think science is hugely important. I think I think that the kind of issues that I've raised are definitely not, as you say, limited to or isolated to autism research at all. I think this kind of disconnect between often kind of life and what we see in the lab is something that occurs, beyond autism in cognition, more cognitive science or psychology more generally. But I think there is, I mean, I'm not suggesting there's only one way to approach this, but the approach that we are taking, at least to start this, to start looking at these issues. So, for example, in the inertia study that I very briefly described, I mean, inertia is remarkable. Like, inertia was, I think, first described by an autistic self-advocate in the Netherlands in 1999, and there is only, until last year, there was nothing at all in the research literature on inertia, despite it being described, in blogs all the time by autistic people themselves. And, it kind of seems to link really closely to what we think of executive control, executive function, but nobody's actually looked at that. And so what we're doing, and what I would be suggesting, is that this kind of analysis requires a more kind of multi-layered approach, which kind of really integrates, maybe quantitative or objective or third person, whatever you want to call it, components of the scientific method. So systematic observation, measurement, those kind of things.
Yeah.
And then also those qualitative first person subjective methods. And so in doing that, for example, what we're doing is we're gaining those first, in our study, what we're doing is, to begin, we're looking at kind of first person phenomenological perspectives. So we're doing interviews with people. We're also doing kind of a Delphi study where we're trying to get consensus on what autistic people, define as autistic inertia. And once we've got that, I think then we can start to do observation and measurements, preferably, I think, in the wild rather than necessarily in the lab. But then to possibly test against standard lab-based measures to try and understand, what's actually underpinning this construct. So what I'm not suggesting is that we just focus on phenomenology or first-person perspectives. I think because I want to know what, the cognitive underpinnings are of this thing that people call inertia, or this experience. But I think, we need both approaches to try and understand this thing of interest. And this might not work for everything we're interested in. But I think this is one, and it's one approach that has been written about in the literature. So it's not me that's proposing this approach at all. This comes from cognitive science literature, people who are trying to use both kind of more subjective, or to kind of triangulate those subjective and objective understandings to come to something. But to be short, I'm all up for science. I'm not saying I'm not a scientist anymore. I think it's hugely important, but I think there are limits to our at least currently, to our science, and I think there are ways in which we might be able to kind of enhance our science. So that's my response.
Okay, great. Yes. I thought that's where you didn't sound as if you were throwing science out the window. I was sort of
that's good.
calling science a more traditional, and as you say, sort of, all right. Well, what do we do with all the thoughts we've had about cognitive functioning and the cognitive level of analysis? So that's great. Thanks. And there's a question there, Antonia. Yes. Sorry. Oh, okay. No question. Yeah. Oh, might not working. Well, if you want to write it, that'll be okay. Okay. You should have access. I haven't closed anybody off. You should have access. So it's nothing to do with us. But if you can write it up, maybe. Yeah, it does happen with this. Yeah. This is like WhatsApp, isn't it? Just seeing what's it? Typing. There it is. Okay.
I'm not actually in Australia anymore. Do you? So I've just moved back to the to London. Not that long ago. So I'm totally fine that you didn't know. We moved back about less than 2 months ago. So I'm now based at University College London. Do you mean what you, in terms of research, that people in Australia are more open to doing kind of first-person qualitative research? Not in research. So how stakeholders feel about doing first-person? Is that what you mean? Sorry.
Could the question be related to are there cultural differences in the autistic community themselves, sort of, which would be coming across?
Okay. Yeah. So differences in people's in what people might want for themselves or their children's lives. Is that what you mean?
The preferred language that studied from Kenya and the UK preferred language, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's. I mean, there are definitely a diversity of viewpoints within the autistic and autism communities. I think that's fair to say. Not everyone agrees with each other, even within autistic people, the autistic community itself, or autistic people versus parents of children with autism, autistic children. And in terms of Australia, I mean, I kind of think that there are certainly those tensions in Australia, but I think in Australia they're more like they probably are in the UK. I think those tensions are more pronounced in the US, particularly with autistic self-advocates who are, who can speak and for themselves, versus often parents of autistic people who are non-speaking or who have high support needs, who are now termed profoundly autistic. Yeah, there are most definitely those differences. I mean, my own view is that, I don't think it's like politics. People are never going to necessarily agree on everything, but that I think it's really important to have conversations about these things, or to at least start a conversation, and to be able to get people to talk in a really respectful way. I think that's really important. I think you won't resolve anything if we don't even have these have conversations about, what does it mean for an autistic person to have a good life? Whose life is it? Who should be speaking for autistic people? Those kind of things. Yeah, so there are definitely tensions. And I think those tensions are exacerbated in some places compared to others. But I think my view is that, our goal shouldn't necessarily be to resolve those. I don't think we can come to consensus, but that we should nevertheless try to make sure that everyone has a chance to have their say. Excellent.
Okay, well, I think there's time. It's 6:20 now, so we've taken up enough of your afternoon. So now, it happens to everybody. It happens to everybody. You cancel it, and then you don't have to uncancel it, which is part of